Early that morning, the heavy thud of a fist against my front door shattered the quiet of my home. I opened it to find a deputy sheriff holding a formal eviction notice with my name on it. Across the street, my own son-in-law leaned against a brand new Maserati, laughing and holding up his phone to record me. "Hurry up, old man," he shouted, his voice cutting through the crisp North Carolina air. "This house is ours now." I did not yell. I did not panic. I calmly looked at the papers and asked the officer one single question. His face went instantly pale. "My name is Vernon Halstead, 70 years old, a widower, decades removed from my working life as a petroleum chief engineer, and the man whose name sits on the deed to a 5-acre property just outside the Charlotte, North Carolina city limits." A Tuesday morning. What stands out sharpest isn't the knock or the badge, it's the rich, dark smell of the coffee still warm on the burner behind me. The sun hadn't fully cleared the rooftops yet, dragging color across the suburban sky in long, slow brushstrokes of burnt orange and pale purple. The kind of morning my late wife and I used to hold on to for as long as we could. Coffee on the porch. Nothing pressing, just stillness. That stillness came apart fast. Urgent knuckles drove hard against my door, and I set my ceramic travel mug down on the marble counter, wiping my calloused hands dry on a dish towel. "Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge. Glad you found your way here today." Before we get into it, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments, are you listening on headphones right now or letting it play through a speaker? There's something about the way this story sounds that makes me curious. A quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been fictionalized and dramatized for the telling. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. I knew Garland. Decent young man, grew up just a few miles down the road from here. But that morning, he couldn't bring himself to look at me. He kept shifting his weight, a manila folder pressed hard against his chest. "Mr. Halstead." The words came out clipped and formal, stripped of anything easy. "I'm truly sorry to be the one doing this." He pushed a thick stack of legal papers in my direction. Bold black lettering across the top read, "Notice of Eviction." I reached out and took it from him. The document carried a weight that had nothing to do with paper. It was the weight of a betrayal, folded into every page. I didn't rush through the fine print. My eyes drifted past the deputy's shoulder, out over the wide green lawn I'd spent 30 years tending. Sitting half up on the curb across the street, parked illegally with 2 wheels on the grass, was a gleaming slate-gray Maserati. Draped across the hood like he owned the whole street was Breckett Voss, my 42-year-old son-in-law. He was dressed sharp-tailored suit, polished shoes, every inch the self-made startup entrepreneur. He enjoyed performing for an audience. His phone was raised high camera, trained directly on my front porch, and he was laughing, a loud cutting sound that carried across the still morning without any effort at all. He wanted my humiliation on film. He wanted footage of my world coming apart. "Get your bags packed, old man," he hollered from across the pavement, grinning wide. "I told you your time was up." Standing right beside him, arms folded, was Claudine, my own daughter, the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders, the woman whose college tuition, lavish wedding, and every financial emergency between those 2 points I had quietly absorbed, never once asking to be repaid. She was one of its architects, and she was enjoying every second of it. I looked down at the wooden planks under my feet. 30 years ago, I drove every nail into this porch myself, spent whole weekends measuring, cutting, and sanding solid oak so Claudine would have somewhere safe to play. I built this house from the ground up, raised it to stand as a permanent shelter for my family. And now my own blood was planted across the street, waiting for law enforcement to remove me, fully expecting me to shuffle out with nothing but a coat and maybe a bag. They had convinced themselves they were dealing with a helpless old man who had nowhere left to turn. That was their catastrophic miscalculation. My entire career was spent managing massive offshore oil rigs. As chief engineer, I was accountable for billion-dollar operations conducted in the middle of an unforgiving ocean. Every day in that job meant reading complex structures under stress, anticipating catastrophic failures, and neutralizing lethal risks before they could ignite. I am trained thoroughly professionally to identify structural weaknesses, whether those weaknesses run through a deep-water drilling platform or through the character of greedy people standing on my lawn. Pressure doesn't make me crack. It makes me sharper. I observe. I calculate. I endure. And standing there watching the smug satisfaction spread across Breckett's face and the cold set of Claudine's shoulders, I felt whatever remained of my fatherly warmth go out like a pilot light in a cold wind. The patient man who had bankrolled their lifestyle without a word of complaint. The grieving widower who had swallowed his own grief to hold the family together. That man was done. They wanted to run a ruthless scheme of corporate theft, to weaponize the law and strip me of everything I'd built. They had no idea they'd just pulled up a chair across from someone who plays that game to the end. I turned back to Deputy Garland. He was barely breathing, bracing himself for the eruption. The shouting, the tears, the desperate pleading that usually follows a morning like this. I adjusted my glasses and read quietly through the first page of the notice. It stated plainly that the property had been foreclosed under the authority of Voss Holdings Brecket's primary corporate entity. A soft, dry chuckle came out of me. Garland blinked, visibly unsettled by my composure. I tapped the page with one finger and let the silence sit for another beat. "Officer Garland?" I said, my voice low and unhurried. "Before you go any further, I have one straightforward question." He gave a quick nod, his throat working. "Go ahead, Mr. Halstead." I pointed to the official seal. "This eviction notice was filed by Voss Holdings, claiming full ownership of my land. But are you aware that this entire 5-acre property was locked into an irrevocable blind trust back in 2016, selling it, transferring it, or pledging it as collateral? None of that is legally permissible. Not for anyone, including me. So, what I need you to explain is exactly what forged fraudulent document my son-in-law used to get past a federal judge and land you on my porch this morning." Garland went still. The color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might go down right there on the steps. His hand drifted away from his utility belt without him seeming to realize it. In that fraction of a second, it registered he wasn't here enforcing a routine eviction. He had been drawn into a serious federal crime, and he was standing at the center of it. The young deputy swallowed hard, his eyes moving between the manila folder in his hands and the smug figure of my son-in-law across the street. When he looked back at me, his uniform seemed to fit him differently, like it suddenly belonged to someone older and more certain. "Sir, I just process whatever the county clerk sends over," he said, his voice dropping to a shaky near whisper. The paperwork had a judge's signature. Everything appeared standard. I kept my posture easy and gave him a slow, measured nod. "I know that's your job, son," I said, "but standard paperwork doesn't reach inside an irrevocable blind trust. A judge would only sign an eviction order if someone submitted a deed showing legal transfer of ownership, and since that transfer cannot legally occur, whoever filed this committed perjury and placed forged documents before a federal court." Garland looked back down at the folder, and his hands were visibly trembling now. He was a good kid. He grasped exactly what I was laying out. If he moved forward and removed me from my home on the basis of fabricated corporate paperwork, he would be a participant in a federal felony. He stepped back from the doorway, putting some respectful distance between us. "Mr. Halstead, what would you like me to do?" he asked, every trace of official authority gone from his voice. "Just hold on," I said quietly, settling my shoulder against the door frame. "Don't call it in yet. Don't go near the vehicle across the street. Just stand here on the porch with me for a minute and let them believe they've already won." Garland nodded, angling his body away from the street so Breckett and Claudine couldn't read the alarm written across his face. Across the pavement, Breckett still had his phone raised, certain he was capturing the moment I fell apart. Claudine was leaning in close to him, whispering something, a cruel little smile on her lips. They were convinced they had pulled off something flawless, that they'd outmaneuvered a senile old man, too generous and too trusting to see it coming. Watching my daughter celebrate my ruin from across the street, my mind pulled back from the cold morning air. I needed to retrace everything to recall precisely how this trap had been assembled. To understand the full shape of what they'd done, you have to go back to where it actually started. This didn't erupt from sudden cruelty. It was built carefully over time, with tears and manipulation and a calculated exploitation of a father's love. The groundwork was laid exactly 4 months earlier, on a miserable rain-soaked Tuesday night in late November. I was settled into my worn leather recliner with an engineering journal when the doorbell began ringing in a panic. It was past midnight. I pulled open the heavy oak door to find Claudine and Breckett on the porch, soaked through and looking utterly hollowed out. Claudine was crying hard, mascara running down her face in dark streaks. Breckett stood beside her like a man who'd already lost everything and was only beginning to understand it. I brought them inside, got them dry towels, and put the kettle on. Breckett dropped into a chair at the kitchen table and stared at his hands. His tech startup, he said, was days from total collapse. A former business partner had filed a malicious lawsuit against him, freezing every corporate asset he held. Legal bills were draining them dry, and without a substantial emergency loan. From the bank, they'd lose their home within the week and be left with nothing. Claudine stretched her hands across the table and wrapped them around mine, cold as stone. Her eyes found mine with a raw desperation that went straight to my core. "Dad, please." A sob broke through her voice, coming apart at the edges. "We have absolutely nowhere to turn. Breckett's assets are frozen. The bank is refusing to move forward without serious collateral behind the loan. If this money doesn't materialize, we end up on the street. You promised Mom you'd always take care of me. Please, don't let us go under like this." Pulling her mother into it hit me like something physical, a blow I hadn't seen coming. My wife had been the beating heart of everything we built together. Those last hours, her hand tight around mine, the hospital room, quiet around us. She'd made me promise to always be there for our daughter. Claudine knew exactly where to push. She'd mapped my grief the way an engineer maps a fault line, and she drove straight into it. I asked what specifically they needed. I floated the idea of cashing in mutual funds, writing them a personal loan to absorb the immediate pressure. Breckett dragged a hand through his damp hair and shook his head. "A cash infusion won't touch the real problem, Vernon," he said, his voice wrung dry. "What the bank requires is long-term appreciating collateral tied to my corporate portfolio. We'd only be moving the management rights to this property over to my holding company temporarily." My back stiffened at once. I told him that was off the table. This land was my bedrock. Everything I'd built rested on it. Breckett immediately softened both palms, coming up in a gesture of calm. "Vernon, you're hearing this the wrong way. We're not talking about ownership changing hands. What we're describing is a family limited liability company. Estate planners recommend it constantly. It's the standard method for protecting inherited assets from the tax burden that hits when you're gone. Management rights shift into the LLC. The bank reads it as managed equity and releases the loan. Your tax exposure gets neutralized. You stay right here in your own home. Day-to-day life doesn't shift by an inch. Smooth delivery, airtight framing. The U.S. tax code genuinely does punish inherited wealth, and family management structures are a legitimate tool. Breckett performed it all with the effortless fluency of a man who had sold his way out of tight corners before. Meanwhile, Claudine sat beside me, clutching my hands, weeping her whole bearing, begging me to save her. I looked at my daughter, and what I registered was the small, frightened child I'd shielded for decades. I didn't see the architect of a trap she'd been engineering with my name on it. Every quiet alarm going off inside me got overruled. I told them to bring the paperwork in the morning. I was certain I was keeping a promise to my wife. I had no understanding of what I'd actually just set in motion. Morning came, and Breckett arrived carrying a thick accordion of documents and a notary who volunteered nothing. The opening pages matched the story from the night before the family corporation laid out just as described. I put my name on the line. The kill clause buried deep in that stack never crossed my eyes. That was 4 months ago. Now, here I stood on my porch alongside Deputy Garland, while Breckett and Claudine waited across the pavement for the law to carry me out. The November storm, the theatrical tears, all of it had receded to somewhere distant. The picture was clear to me now. No family management company ever existed. No plan to protect what I'd built. What they were after was the deed itself, and they'd lifted it out from under me with neither hesitation nor regret. Every detail of that midnight visit is still sharp in my mind. The storm had been gathering force all afternoon, sweeping down across the North Carolina plains with something mean and relentless behind it. Rain came in hard sheets against the glass, and a long, low roll of thunder ran almost without break. I'd been in my worn leather recliner in the study, a technical engineering journal open across my lap under the desk lamp, the kind of quiet, solitary night I'd always found restorative. Then the doorbell began ringing in short, panicked bursts, wrong for that hour entirely. Nobody hammers a doorbell past midnight without something driving them to it. I marked my page, felt a genuine weight of worry settle in my chest, and went to the door. When it swung open, the storm pushed rain straight across the hardwood. Standing on the porch, both of them soaked and hollowed out, were Claudine and Breckett. Claudine was shaking her expensive coat-saturated mascara, carved into dark channels down her face. Breckett looked like a man on his third sleepless night, hair-matted flat eyes, bloodshot and darting. I didn't reach for questions first. Everything in me that was a father moved before anything else could. I got them inside, shouldered the heavy oak door, closed against the weather, steered them both toward the kitchen. Towels from the laundry room, kettle on the burner. Claudine cried through all of it, palms pressed to her face, her whole body shaking with it. Beckett planted himself at the head of the kitchen table, fingers locked around a steaming mug like it was an anchor, eyes fixed on the wood grain below him. He held the posture of a ruined man, with a commitment that should have told me something. I drew out the chair across from him, watched Claudine blot her face, and asked them calmly what had happened. Beckett pulled a slow, uneven breath and raised eyes full of something that read as despair, but was constructed. His technology startup, he said, was within days of total failure. A former partner had brought a sweeping malicious lawsuit down on the company. The injunction that followed had locked every corporate account and every personal asset he owned. Fighting to dissolve that injunction was burning through whatever was left. He walked me through all of it. Without a major rescue loan secured before the week was out, the business would collapse, their house would be gone, and they'd have nothing to show for any of it. He was good at this. The financial fluency was real, and he dialed the vulnerability to exactly the right frequency. I took it in the way I'd taken in instrument readings on a rig-steady methodical hunting for the anomaly. But before my instincts could catch up, Claudine executed her part. She reached across the table and closed her still-cold fingers around my hands. She held my gaze, and whatever expression she'd assembled looked genuine all the way down. "Dad, please," she whispered, barely audible above the rain. "We have run out of options. There's nothing left to try. The bank won't move while Beckett's assets are frozen in litigation. We are going to lose the house. There will be nothing left." Then she played the card she'd been holding back. The one precision instrument she knew would bypass every defense I had remaining. "Mom always made you promise to protect me, Dad." Softly spoken tears already falling. "She made you swear you would never let me fall. Please don't let us lose everything." Invoking her mother's memory reached something in me that logic can't touch. My wife had been the soul of this family, its gravity. In those last days, her hand light and cool in mine, beside the hospital bed, she'd look straight at me and made me promise I would always be there for our daughter. Claudine understood exactly what that oath weighed. She knew my grief had never gone fully silent, and she raised it like a lever against me with the precision of a surgeon. Every quiet reservation I'd been accumulating got buried under instinct. I looked at my daughter in tears and the wreckage of a man beside her and told them to calm down. I wasn't going to stand by while they lost everything. I offered to move on my mutual funds, immediately write a personal check, a real loan enough to carry them, until the legal freeze lifted and their accounts opened back up. Beckett shook his head slowly, fingers working through his still damp hair. "A check doesn't fix the architecture of the problem, Vernon," he said, draping exhaustion over every word. "What the bank's examiners want is long-term appreciating collateral on the books behind the corporate portfolio, a tangible hard asset. That's the lever that gets the loan released and keeps the company alive." My engineer's instincts engaged before I'd consciously decided anything. I told him flat that this property wasn't going anywhere as collateral. This 5-acre piece of ground was my foundation, the inheritance I was building for the people who came after me. Beckett eased back at once, hands open, radiating patience. "Vernon, I don't think you're hearing what we're actually proposing," he said, voice measured and low. "We would never put your home at risk. What we're suggesting is a family-limited liability company, entirely standard practice." He walked me through it, with practiced ease management rights, he said, would be parked temporarily under his holding company. He leaned forward, dropping into the measured, confidential register of someone performing trustworthiness. The framing was all about protection. Shifting management rights into the new corporate entity would register the property as managed equity on his balance sheet. The bank would see real backing, greenlight the emergency loan, and as an added benefit, I'd avoid the death taxes that could cripple my estate. "You carry on living here exactly as you always have," he said, holding my eyes. "Nothing in your life shifts, but you save ours in the process." A persuasive case. The American tax code genuinely does punish inherited wealth, and a family management corporation is a recognized tool for shielding generational assets. He delivered the whole argument in the polished, fluent vocabulary of a seasoned dealmaker, legitimate fiscal strategy dressed up as cover for outright theft. The sharp hook buried inside the offer never registered. The following morning, the storm was gone, leaving behind a deceptively clean North Carolina sky. I was at the kitchen counter pulling my first cup of black coffee when the heavy tires of Brackett's leased SUV ground up the gravel drive. He hadn't come alone. With him was a man he introduced as his corporate notary, a nervous, perspiring figure named Odell, who had the particular look of someone operating on no sleep for days. Odell wore a rumpled gray suit that smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. He had a thick leather briefcase locked against his chest, as though it held classified material, his eyes roving my home with an unsettling blend of curiosity and appetite. Under any normal circumstances, my instincts would have revolted at the sight of such an unprofessional character presiding over sensitive financial paperwork. In decades of managing engineering contracts, I had worked alongside elite legal professionals, people of exacting precision and bearing. But my judgment was fogged by a single image I couldn't shake. My daughter collapsed on my floor in tears just hours before. I was playing the role the situation expected of me, the worn-down, grieving father, hollowed out by the emotional weight of the previous night, wanting only to restore some measure of peace to what was left of my family. I simply wanted Claudine to stop weeping. I wanted to honor the promise I'd made her mother. Brackett guided Odell to the large oak dining table and signaled him to open the briefcase. Odell worked the brass clasps and produced a formidable stack of legal documents, setting them squarely in front of my chair. Brackett positioned himself just behind Odell, hovering over the table with a coiled, restless energy. He kept a practiced smile in place, but there was a faint sheen of perspiration at his forehead that his composure couldn't entirely cover. Vernon, Brackett said, his tone deliberate and carefully respectful. I can't begin to say what this means to us. Our legal team worked through the night to make sure we'd meet the bank's deadline. As we discussed, this is strictly the formation of the Family Limited Liability Company and the authorization to transfer management rights of this estate into the corporate portfolio. His manicured finger traced a line through the dense legal text at the top of the stack. He launched into an elaborate breakdown of American estate tax codes, working in terms like generational wealth, transfer asset protection shields, and fiduciary management buffers. It sounded thoroughly authoritative. The logic of sidestepping crippling inheritance taxes on my eventual passing made complete sense on the surface. It's a standard strategy deployed by wealthy families across the country to keep their accumulated assets beyond the federal government's reach. I had no cause to believe that a man who'd sat at my Thanksgiving table for 10 years was using legitimate tax planning as a smokescreen for outright theft. I settled into my chair, picked up the heavy brass pen Odell had nervously set down, and adjusted my reading glasses. I began moving through the pages, at least 50 pages of densely single-spaced text. The opening sections I read carefully. They outlined the creation of Voss Family Holdings and defined my role as a passive beneficiary, with Brackett stepping in as managing director. It matched everything we had discussed: a temporary measure to shore up his company against a malicious lawsuit, a bureaucratic arrangement to demonstrate to bank examiners that his portfolio carried genuine weight. The legitimate-sounding language in those early pages put me at ease in a way I would deeply come to regret. I let my guard down, letting fatigue and fatherly love override the analytical instincts I had spent a career sharpening. Brackett moved closer, his voice low and steady. Just initial the bottom of each page, Vernon, and sign wherever the yellow tabs are marked. It's mostly standard boilerplate the state of North Carolina requires for LLC formation. Odell leaned in, uncapping his ink pad and positioning his notary stamp. I began signing. Page after page of bureaucratic filler, the scratch of the pen, the only sound in the quiet kitchen. My mind kept drifting to Claudine's desperate pleas. I thought about the promise I'd made to her mother. I was convinced at my core that I was doing something honorable, a selfless act, to pull my child back from the edge of financial ruin. I was completely unaware of the lethal document that had been slipped with surgical precision into the exact center of that stack. Buried among pages of meaningless corporate bylaws and tax indemnification language sat one devastating sheet, a quitclaim deed. Putting my name on that particular page meant I wasn't transferring management rights at all. I was legally surrendering all ownership, all equity, and every claim I held to my 5-acre property, handing it over outright to Brackett's holding company. I was signing away the home I had built with my own hands, transferring a multi-million-dollar piece of land to a predator without collecting a single cent. But I never read that page. My eyes were heavy. My heart was carrying its grief, and I trusted my family. I signed exactly where the bright yellow tab directed me, and the trap closed around my ankle. The moment my pen left the final signature line, the entire atmosphere in the room changed. The tight, suffocating tension that had surrounded Beckett from the moment he walked in dissolved, replaced by something close to alarming euphoria. He exhaled hard and nearly lifted the documents off the table before the ink had finished drying. Odell began stamping in rapid, efficient succession, hands moving with a sudden purpose that made clear he'd been holding himself back, waiting for this. Beckett reached over and gripped my shoulder with a force that read less like gratitude and more like conquest. "Vernon, you have saved us," he announced, his voice pitched a fraction too loud for the quiet kitchen. "You have no idea what you have just done for our future. I'm taking these straight to the bank right now. We are going to be completely fine." He didn't stay to discuss the supposed legal battle. He gathered the documents with startling speed and walked straight out the front door, leaving me standing alone at the kitchen table. That afternoon, Claudine called. The shattered, trembling woman from the night before had vanished entirely. Her voice was easy and untroubled. She thanked me, said the bank had pre-approved the loan, and that everything had come back together. She sounded so completely settled that a small, cold seed of unease took root somewhere at the back of my mind, just enough to stir my analytical instincts, quietly flagging that people don't rebound from the edge of total collapse that quickly. But I chose not to follow the thought. I refilled my coffee, looked out over the wide green lawn, and told myself my home was safe and my family was whole. I had no idea the clock on my own undoing had already started running. I had no idea my sanctuary had been taken from me legally, cleanly, without a flicker of hesitation. The full weight of their betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It walked onto my property exactly 2 weeks before Deputy Garland ever appeared on my porch, delivered in the form of a routine bureaucratic intrusion on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The North Carolina sun was warm on the back of my neck as I knelt in the soft dirt of the front garden, carefully trimming the heritage camellia bushes that my late wife had planted the very first spring we moved into this house. Gardening had become my quiet discipline since she passed away, to keep my hands occupied and my mind anchored to something real. I was beating dirt from my canvas work gloves when a jolt of neon yellow pulled at the edge of my vision. I got to my feet slowly, the usual argument from aging joints, and narrowed my eyes against the afternoon glare. About 50 yards out near the iron gates that marked the western edge of my 5-acre property stood a stranger. High-visibility vest over a plaid shirt, white hard hat, heavy boots. Next to him in the grass sat a yellow tripod carrying a sophisticated digital theodolite. He had his eye to the lens, working the leveling knobs in small, deliberate increments and punching notes into a tablet fastened to his forearm. My first Reed County surveyor. The municipality sent crews through periodically Waterline's boundary verification along the main road. Probably drifted a few yards past the public easement onto my side. I wiped my forehead, retrieved my solid walnut cane from the porch, and walked across the lawn to point him back where he belonged. He heard me coming through the dry grass and pulled upright one hand, shading his eyes, and offered a friendly nod. "Good afternoon, sir," he said easily. "Beautiful piece of land you've got out here." I stopped about 10 feet short of his equipment and nodded back. "Thank you, I've put considerable work into it. But I need to know what brings you through that gate. County jurisdiction ends roughly 30 feet back toward the road. Everything you're standing on is private residential ground." He pulled an apologetic face and tapped his tablet, scrolling through something I couldn't read from where I stood. "No confusion intended, sir," he said, his forehead creasing. "I'm not a county employee, independent commercial contractor. Catawba Commercial Bank commissioned me for a full topographic survey and commercial appraisal of this parcel." Something cold took up residence in my chest. I kept every muscle still. An engineer confronted with an anomaly doesn't raise his voice. He asks questions. A commercial appraisal, I said, holding the register flat despite the chill moving outward from my spine. "That doesn't follow. This has been a private single-family home for 30 years. No commercial activity has ever occurred on this land. None is planned." The man's face traveled from mild confusion to something closer to discomfort. I could see him running a quiet calculation, eccentric property owner or elderly man who's lost the thread of what's happening around him. "Sir, I only work the jobs I'm assigned," he said, easing his tone carefully. but the bank's file designates this entire 5-acre parcel as under active evaluation for a large-scale commercial redevelopment. My fingers locked around the walnut cane, the grain pressing into my palm. A redevelopment, I said, and what was left of any warmth in my voice went out entirely. Who filed the order? He swiped the screen and brought up the executive summary. When he read the name aloud, each word hit separately. Primary applicant on file is Voss Holdings LLC. Steady, even. The bank needs this topographic data to close out a multi-million-dollar commercial construction loan. The approved blueprints call for full demolition of all existing residential structures on the plot. Voss Holdings is scheduled to break ground on a luxury commercial strip mall next month. The breeze off the lawn turned cold against my face. Every sound around me, the mockingbirds, the low ribbon of highway noise. The oak leaves overhead dropped away into a hollow, ringing quiet. The part of my brain trained over decades to read structural failure started processing without waiting for my permission. Voss Holdings LLC, brackets company, the one that was supposedly doing nothing more than holding passive management rights as a buffer against future estate taxes. The one Claudine had assured me was only backstopping a modest emergency loan to keep them from losing their house. They were never after management rights. They had walked me through a choreographed sequence of steps designed to end with me signing over my home so they could bulldoze it and collect a commercial windfall off the wreckage. The surveyor shifted his footing, unsettled by how long I'd gone quiet. "Are you doing all right, sir?" He moved a step closer. "Should I call someone for you? Are you renting this property?" His words brought me back into the moment. I looked at the theodolite, its lens pointing straight at the front door of the house where I had raised my daughter, the house where my wife had breathed her last. I took one slow breath and pushed everything, the rage, the grief, all of it down deep and bricked it over. "I'm quite all right," I said, voice steady and measured. "I'm not a tenant. I'm the man who built that house with his own hands. I appreciate you telling me why you're here. Do your job. I'm not going to interfere. Finish your measurements and take care getting home." I turned and made the long walk back toward the porch. Each step across that lawn landed differently than the ones I'd taken going the other direction. The ground didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a site in dispute. I took the porch steps one at a time, the boards beneath my feet somehow denser than I remembered them being. I bypassed my usual chair, didn't touch the kitchen, went straight down the hall and into the study. The room had a different quality. Something in the air had shifted, fouled by whatever was being drawn up just outside those windows. I lifted my phone off the desk and rested my thumb on Claudine's name. Part of me, the father part that never fully closes down, still wanted this to be some monstrous administrative error. But the other part, the one that had spent 35 years reading instruments under pressure, had already arrived at the answer. I made the call. 4 rings. Then the line opened, and what hit me first wasn't a voice, it was a soundscape. Not the noise of a company scraping through a legal crisis. Crystal glasses meeting in a toast. The relaxed, well-fed laughter of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Beneath it all, a jazz quartet moving through something smooth and unhurried on a quality sound system. "Claudine," I said, keeping my voice at an even keel. "We need to have a conversation. There's a man operating a digital theodolite on the western boundary of my land. He informs me he's running a commercial topographic survey commissioned by Voss Holdings." A brief silence. I heard her cover the receiver no more than a second and murmur something to Beckett. When she returned, her voice had shifted into the register people adopt, for the very young or the senile, all softness and rehearsed patience. "Dad!" she breathed with a sigh she'd been holding in reserve. "You're getting confused again. I explained this already. Remember, that's a routine tax appraisal. It's part of the administrative process tied to the family management company we put in place to protect your estate. There's nothing to worry about. Let the man do his work and head back to the garden. Everything is fine." A voice came over a PA system somewhere behind her. The words were half swallowed by distance, but one phrase landed clean, fresh powder on the summit. "A ski resort. Aspen." "Claudine," I said, and I let none of her tone touch mine. "County tax appraisers don't show up with commercial demolition blueprints. This contractor told me directly that Voss Holdings intends to tear down every structure on this land and put up a luxury strip mall." A hairline fracture appeared in the sweetness. "Dad, you are reading far too much into a standard procedure. The bank requires commercial format documentation for parcels of this acreage. It's administrative boilerplate. Beckett is handling all of the financial complexity on your behalf, so none of this needs to land on your plate. We're currently in a critical meeting with investors, and I genuinely cannot continue this right now. Put the kettle on, make yourself some tea, all right, I love you." She ended the call. The dial tone sat in the quiet study like a held note. I placed the phone on the desk. No slamming, no profanity, no hand through the wall. What came instead was something colder and more useful than any of that, a clarity that started at the center of me and moved outward until it reached the edges. 35 years as a petroleum chief engineer, one discipline practiced until it was reflex locate the fault before the fault locates you. On a deep water drilling platform, a hairline crack in a single pressure valve doesn't give warnings before it detonates. Billions gone, hundreds of lives with them. That training doesn't have an off switch. You never discard the data. It doesn't matter how desperately you want the numbers to tell a different story. You work the math. You test the load-bearing structure. You let evidence win the argument. Alone in my study, I put that same engineering discipline to work on my own daughter and son-in-law. I began assembling the data points. First one. 4 months back, Beckett sat at my kitchen table and looked me in the eye, swearing that a predatory lawsuit had his technology company in a chokehold. His assets were locked up, he told me. Financial collapse was nearly on top of him. Second data point. Barely 2 weeks ago, Beckett pulled into my driveway, delivering my groceries from behind the wheel of a brand new custom-ordered, gleaming slate gray Maserati. When I brought it up, he shrugged it off short-term corporate lease. He said an image investment the clients expected. Third data point. Claudine had answered my call from a luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado, claiming she was tied up in an investor meeting, while the unmistakable soundtrack of clinking glasses and easy laughter pushed right through the phone on a Tuesday afternoon. The load-bearing structure of everything they had told me was collapsing from within. People facing bankruptcy don't acquire six-figure luxury vehicles. People on the razor's edge of total ruin don't vanish on extravagant weekday escapes to high-end mountain retreats. The numbers didn't add up. Every pressure gauge in my gut was screaming that something had failed. They weren't going under, they were flush. I found myself dragged back to that night. They showed up desperate, pleading for my help. I had put my liquid savings on the table. I had been prepared to write a personal check on the spot to stop them from losing their house. Beckett had turned it down flat. Money wasn't the point. What he needed specifically, precisely, insistently, was the deed to my land, the ground itself, the hard physical asset. The surveyor had not been mistaken. Those blueprints were entirely legitimate. Beckett and Claudine had turned my grief into a weapon. They seized on my deep love for my late wife and the vow I made to protect our daughter, and drove it like a crowbar into the gap between me and everything I owned. They had built a flawless legal shell to pry a multi-million-dollar property out of my hands, planning all along to flatten the last tangible thing that still connected me to her. I moved to the bay window and looked down across the front lawn. Out there, the surveyor was folding up his bright yellow tripod, calling it a day. Every measurement he recorded tightened another bolt on my fate. The grief I'd been carrying for 4 months began shifting, not dissolving, but hardening, compressing into something cold and structural, a foundation of pure resolve. The grieving widower trying to keep his family intact was gone. What remained was an engineer running a fault analysis on a catastrophic system failure. Beckett and Claudine were convinced every line of defense I had was already down. They figured age had made me slow, soft, easy to manage. But an engineer doesn't operate on assumptions. An engineer goes looking for physical proof. The next step was clear to me before I'd even finished the thought. I had to lay eyes on the full blueprint of what they'd done, the actual raw evidence. That meant getting inside their house while it sat empty. Whatever they were hiding was waiting there in the dark, and I intended to bring it into the light. I climbed into my pickup and pointed it toward one fixed purpose. The drive from my property out to Beckett and Claudine's rented townhouse in that upscale neighborhood ran close to 40 minutes. Each mile tightened something inside my chest, the anger there going denser, more mineral. I'd tucked a small stack of misdelivered mail pieces that had come to my address by mistake a few days prior into the seat beside me. A believable excuse for an unannounced visit. If either of them answered the door, I'd hand over the envelopes, keep my face neutral, and leave. But the instincts I'd honed over a lifetime of anticipating what goes wrong told me nobody would be home. Claudine had claimed an investor meeting, while every background sound placed her at a luxury ski resort. Beckett was almost certainly beside her, drinking to the money, already as good as theirs. I rolled onto their tree-lined street and pulled over 2 houses short. The whole block sat in a polished, manicured stillness, trimmed hedges, high-end cars in the drives, not a soul in sight. I picked up the mail, walked the length of their concrete driveway, and pushed the lit doorbell. I counted the seconds quietly. I rang it once more. Nothing moved inside. No steps, no shape shifting behind the frosted glass panels. Empty. I stepped back from the door, pulse slow and even. I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross, but they had already blown past a far more consequential one when they took my entire future. I left the porch and headed along the side path toward the rear alley at a calm, deliberate pace. The walk of a man who belongs exactly where he's standing. Back behind a tall wooden privacy fence, 3 large municipal bins sat waiting lids strained against tomorrow's collection hall. In engineering, when you have reason to believe something has gone catastrophically wrong, you don't petition the responsible party for a confession. You go looking for the data they threw away. You examine what ended up in the waste stream. I pried up the lid of the black recycling bin, underneath a top layer of empty imported wine bottles and upmarket takeout packaging. I hit what I came for. 2 grocery bags knotted tight, crammed with torn paper. No hesitation. I took them by the handles and walked directly back to my truck. I set them on the passenger floorboard, started the engine, and pulled out without once checking the mirror. Both hands on the wheel, I traced my way back through those winding residential streets. Something had settled over me, a strange, frictionless clarity. 4 months of confusion and raw grief had drained away completely. What was left was pure logic, and underneath it, a slow-burning need for justice that went all the way to the bone. I had to see what they'd built against me with my own eyes. By the time I reached my property, the late sun had already dipped below the tree line. I brought the bags in locked up behind me and went to work. In the living room, I pushed the coffee table out of the way and rolled a wide vinyl tarp flat across the hardwood. I upended the first bag, junk mail, slick catalogs, empty envelopes that held nothing. The second bag was a different matter entirely. Inside was a thick tangled mass of cross-cut shreds. Beckett had run everything through a serious machine, but in doing so, he had catastrophically misjudged what an engineer is capable of sustaining. He thought reducing the paper to fragments would make the record permanent, irretrievable. What he never accounted for was that piecing together what's been broken apart was exactly the discipline I'd practiced my whole professional life. I lowered myself to the floor, cross-legged, enclosed by thousands of narrow paper strips. Beside me, a roll of clear adhesive tape, sharp tweezers, a strong desk lamp aimed straight down. I started sorting. Blue ink shreds to one group, black to another. Strips carrying red corporate letterhead to a separate pile. The hours stacked up in silence. The daylight died, and the room contracted to the hard circle of lamplight around me. My back seized and my eyes felt scraped raw, but the possibility of stopping didn't register. By the time midnight arrived, a coherent and deeply alarming shape had emerged across the tarp. The first document I put back together was an internal email thread between Beckett and a major commercial real estate developer. The subject line read, "Project Sanctuary Acquisition." That phrase hit me like a structural failure. They had named their demolition scheme after the exact word I had always used for this house. The thread mapped out a precise schedule for moving the deed out of the fraudulent family management entity and into a newly formed corporate holding account, one that Beckett controlled entirely. But the most devastating piece wasn't the emails. It was a sprawling multi-page financial prospectus, dense with specifics and carrying full legal weight. I pressed the final strip of the summary page into place and read the text printed in bold. The document detailed a commercial development proposal with a budget of exactly $3.5 million. It carried my exact street address, my precise lot boundaries, the geographic coordinates of my land. The plan called for tearing down every structure on the property, removing the ancient oak trees, and pouring a massive concrete parking lot over all of it. The primary anchor tenant identified on the second page was a high-end corporate retail chain, My Home, My Sanctuary. It was never part of any tax shielding strategy. It had been marked for complete and irreversible demolition inside 30 days. I leaned back on my heels and held the reconstructed documents in my gaze until the black print went soft and blurry. The cold, calculated precision of what they had assembled against me was almost incomprehensible. This was never about desperation. It was never a last-ditch move to save a technology company that had run out of road. This was corporate predation planned in advance and executed with care. The email thread I'd reconstructed reached back 8 months. They had been building this machinery long before the night they showed up on my porch, faces wet, voices breaking. What I'm about to show you is the moment everything I thought I knew had to be weighed against the cold, hard evidence. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If you ever suspected that someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them face to face, or would you stay silent and build your case first? Claudine's heaving sobs, Brackett's frantic pacing back and forth, the calculated invocation of my dead wife's name. Every element had been scripted and rehearsed, engineered, to reach past my reason and drive straight into my most exposed emotional territory. They understood that no rational argument would pry that land from me. They knew what that house represented, how much life had accumulated within those walls. So, they stopped trying to convince my mind and went for my heart instead. They invented a crisis from nothing, imported a fraudulent notary, and slipped a genuine quitclaim deed into the middle of a stack of fabricated management paperwork. They stripped me of my property in plain sight, grinning through the whole operation as their perfectly laid trap closed around me. Now, at last, the full shape of what they had done came into terrible clarity. I sat there on the study floor, the shredded remnants of a reality I barely recognized spread all around me. The initial wave of sickening shock had peaked and receded, leaving behind something cold and hollow. I looked at the reconstructed document in front of me, following the lines that charted the erasure of everything I'd spent my life building. The scale of their greed was nearly impossible to hold in the mind. Taking the property wasn't enough. They wanted every blade of grass, every brick, every memory fed into a demolition machine for a commercial payday. But as the emotional fog began to thin, a sharper question forced its way through. The fragments fit together. They showed me the target, but not the mechanism. How had they managed to legally shackle me to my own destruction? I shut my eyes and walked myself back to that morning in the kitchen. I ran the whole sequence again, every variable, every word exchanged, every movement in the room. There was the tall stack of legal documents laid out across the dining table. Brackett stood just behind my shoulder, voice measured and calm, guiding my eye to the bright yellow tabs. Odell, the sweaty notary, had his stamp gripped like he was guarding it. The architecture of the deception began to resolve. The documents near the top of the pile were legitimate standard corporate boilerplate, establishing Voss family holdings language that tracked precisely with the short-term management transfer story they'd sold me. I had worked through those opening pages with care, satisfying myself that they matched the narrative about a temporary arrangement to sidestep estate taxes. But somewhere past the midpoint of that stack, my eyes had gone heavy, and my chest had sunk under the weight of my daughter's manufactured grief. The fine print stopped registering. I was running on trust alone. I moved my pen from one yellow tab to the next, initialing and signing wherever Brackett directed me. That was the exact moment the switch was made. Buried deep within the sedating layers of corporate bylaws and tax indemnification language sat the lethal quitclaim deed, a single document designed to sever my ownership entirely and transfer the full legal title of my 5-acre estate straight into Brackett's corporate holding account in one stroke. By signing that page, I had surrendered a multi-million-dollar property without collecting a single penny. Odell was there to provide the official stamp, pressing his notary seal onto the transfer to make the whole fraudulent operation legally bulletproof. They had turned my love, my fatigue, and my trust into instruments, using them to dismantle every rational defense I possessed. My hands balled into fists, fingernails biting into my palms. Something dark and primal ignited in my chest. Every raw instinct in me screamed to grab my keys and drive straight to their townhouse. I wanted to put my boot through their front door. I wanted to slam the taped blueprint down on their expensive glass coffee table and demand to know how my own daughter could do this to me. I wanted to scream at them until my throat gave out, to force them to look directly at the physical proof of their betrayal. I wanted to watch the composed certainty drain from their faces the instant they understood their airtight scheme had been fully exposed. But my engineering instincts cut that impulse off at the root. When you locate a critical failure inside a volatile system, you do not reach for a hammer. An uncontrolled reaction can bring the entire structure down on itself. Walking through their door right now would mean surrendering the only advantage I held. I would be revealing everything. Beckett was a sharp, slippery corporate operator. The moment he grasped that I had found the fraudulent quitclaim, deed contrition, would be nowhere on his agenda. He would move immediately to the offensive. Digital records would disappear, commercial loan proceeds would be shifted into offshore accounts, and a wall of aggressive defense attorneys would go up around him inside of hours. They would construct a story casting me as a confused, senile old man who had signed his property away of his own free will. They would drown me in litigation until my resources ran dry and I was forced out anyway. I pulled in a slow, deliberate breath and reined my pulse back in. The loving, trusting father, who had wanted nothing more than to look after his little girl, died right there on the study floor. That man was gone, buried beneath the taped-together proof of his daughter's bottomless greed. What remained rising up from the vinyl tarp was something entirely different. No longer a grieving widower. I was a cold and deliberate hunter now, and my targets were directly in my crosshairs. I gathered the reconstructed documents with care, folding the damning commercial blueprint with methodical precision. I walked to the heavy steel safe mounted behind a wall panel in my study, worked the combination, and sealed the evidence inside. I swept up the remaining paper shreds, packed them into a heavy-duty garbage bag, and knotted it shut. Every visible trace of the investigation was gone. The appearance of compliance had to hold. I still had to play the part the unsuspecting cooperative father who believed his family's future was settled and secure. I went to the kitchen and poured the cold dregs of my morning coffee down the sink. I stood there studying my reflection in the dark window glass. The face looking back was weathered, but the eyes behind it were precise and fully lit. If Beckett wanted to run a high-stakes corporate theft operation, I needed to match his firepower. I couldn't dismantle a sophisticated legal scheme with nothing but an engineering background and a reconstruction job pulled from a recycling bin. I needed someone who understood from the inside how commercial real estate fraud was assembled and how it was taken apart. A professional who could systematically unwind Beckett's holding company, lock down his assets, and lay his forgery in front of federal authorities before he had a breath to respond. Not a general-purpose family attorney. I needed a legal predator, a remorseless, tenacious litigator whose career was built on dismantling corrupt executives. My thoughts went back to a major corporate dispute I had been close to a decade earlier. A rival oil conglomerate had moved to seize control of a drilling project using fabricated environmental reports. Our company had brought in an outside legal specialist to handle the fight. He was a brilliant and unsettlingly precise operator who took apart opposing counsel in a matter of weeks and left their executives facing criminal exposure. His name was Aldous Fenwick, and his reputation across the corporate sector was one of absolute unsparing aggression. Aldous Fenwick did not pursue settlements. He dismantled his opponents and left nothing upright in the wreckage. I returned to my study and opened my leather contact book, turning pages until I located his private direct number. I picked up my phone, hand completely steady, and dialed. I waited through the ringing, watching moonlight pull long shadows across the lawn. The hunter was about to become the hunted. 3 rings then, a gruff voice came on the line. It wasn't Aldous Fenwick. His senior partner informed me that Aldous had retired. He did, however, pass along the direct contact for the one man Aldous Fenwick trusted to handle complex asset recovery cases. That man was Whitfield Brannock, a seasoned trust and real estate litigator working out of downtown Charlotte. I outlined the essentials of my situation to his answering service and left my secure contact information. With the legal groundwork quietly set in motion, I understood I needed to buy time to construct an airtight case. Beckett and Claudine were moving at speed, pulled forward by the prospect of an enormous commercial payout. If even the faintest hint of suspicion reached them, any suggestion that I had uncovered the fraudulent quitclaim, they would accelerate the demolition schedule without a second thought. I needed them at ease, fully convinced of their victory, and writing me off entirely as any kind of threat. To hold that illusion, I decided to inhabit precisely the character they had already cast me as in their version of events. I would become the confused, deteriorating old man they were certain they had effortlessly outmaneuvered. The very next morning, I began the careful performance of my own cognitive decline. I started with small, calibrated errors. The first test came when Claudine stopped by, claiming she'd brought lunch. I addressed her by her dead mother's name deliberately precisely, and watched a flicker of triumph light up her face before the mask of practiced condescending concern dropped back into place. I stumbled through our exchange, returning again and again to the same slow questions about her husband's invented legal predicament. In the days after that, I refined the act with an engineer's discipline. My heavy brass keyring turned up on the middle refrigerator shelf, propped against a carton of milk, positioned so Beckett would be the one to pull it out when he went for a beer. I stood back in the hallway and watched him fish those cold keys out his head, shaking a small, cruel remark, disappearing into his collar. Missed phone calls became routine. Afterward, I'd claim I still hadn't sorted out how the smartphone worked. I added a new thread, my heart, I would murmur, settling into the armchair with one hand pressed flat to my chest, drawing air in shallow, labored sips, speaking vaguely about pressure building down my left arm. Claudine performed her own role without a single missed mark, positioning herself over me with counterfeit worry, while her eyes found Beckett's across the room in silent, shared satisfaction. Every note of it landed. From where they stood watching me come apart was not a problem. It was the ideal outcome. A senile, physically failing father lacked the cognitive equipment to challenge a sophisticated corporate real estate transfer. In their estimation, I was already a ghost, still occupying a house that was about to cease to exist. The careful, scripted vigilance of their visits and calls quietly dissolved. They stopped probing me about where I went or what I was doing. The monitoring ceased. They stepped back and left the old man to his decline, confident the outcome was already settled. That was their mistake. That manufactured neglect opened exactly the gap I had been engineering toward. On a crisp Thursday morning, while Beckett and Claudine were supposedly locked in another urgent session with their fictional investors, I made my move. I pulled on a plain gray suit that would register on no one. Unremarkable, forgettable, the sort of thing a man wears to a routine medical visit. My main smartphone stayed behind on the marble counter where it belonged. Beckett had almost certainly buried a location tracking app somewhere inside it, dressed up as a wellness feature. Into my jacket pocket went a prepaid phone bought for cash attached to no name. I got into the pickup, eased out of the gravel drive with my pulse measured and pointed the truck in the wrong direction entirely. No straight shot to the Charlotte skyline. Instead, I threaded through a long string of rural back roads, checking the rearview mirror at every turn. Eventually, I folded onto the highway and let the traffic absorb me. Coming into the city, I swung wide of the parking structures near the legal corridor and left the truck in a shadowy municipal garage 3 blocks out. Cash at the booth collar, up then on foot through the financial district. Charlotte's streets were thick with young professionals moving fast. Not one of them registered the quiet older man keeping pace among them. I walked with a fixed purpose, my attention already in the room ahead. The building I arrived at was the kind that announces its own authority before you reach the door. Dark glass and polished steel stacked against the sky. I sidestepped the main reception area and took a private elevator up to the 32nd floor. Beside the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, a brass plaque read, Whitfield Brannock Corporate Litigation and Trust Recovery. Inside, the waiting room felt like a controlled environment. Modern spare, radiating the particular quiet of a place where serious damage gets done at serious expense. The receptionist occupied a position behind an enormous slab of black marble. I gave my name. Moments later, a staff member guided me the length of a hushed hallway into a corner office whose windows looked out across the North Carolina Capitol. Whitfield Brannock was already on his feet behind a wide, spotless desk. Late 50s, tall, built like someone who had never once left a room at a disadvantage, eyes that sorted information rapidly, and a jaw that suggested his position on most arguments was final. His navy suit was cut to fit the way a piece of precision tooling fits its housing. He reached across with a firm hand and indicated the chair facing him. Mr. Halstead, he said, his voice a low, unhurried baritone, carrying no excess weight. Aldous' former partner briefed me on your situation. He indicated a fraudulent quitclaim deed and a multi-million-dollar commercial demolition scheme put together by members of your own family. I settled into the chair and felt something shift, the accumulated pressure of the past 2 weeks, beginning to move off me and onto that desk. That's accurate, Mr. Brannock, I said. No tremor, no hesitation. None of the senile fog I'd been performing for Claudine's benefit. They ran a bait and switch through a fraudulent family management entity and stripped me of my 5-acre estate. The timeline calls for my home to be leveled inside 30 days and replaced with a luxury retail center. Whitfield Brannock planted both elbows on the polished surface and studied me with the kind of cool, methodical attention that processes a problem rather than reacts to it. A betrayal of this magnitude, most men in your position would be shattered by it. He said, his voice quiet but direct. That's not what I'm seeing across this desk. What I'm seeing is someone who came here ready to fight. I reached into my jacket and produced a thick envelope coordinates corporate registration numbers, the painstakingly reconstructed blueprints I had retrieved from Brackett's garbage. I set it down dead center on the desk between us. I am not shattered, I told him, not breaking his gaze. I am an engineer who has located a catastrophic structural failure. I'm retaining you to dismantle the mechanism they built, lock down their assets, and leave nothing behind. I want them completely and utterly destroyed. Whitfield Brannock's expression didn't waver. What moved across his face was something closer to the expression a precise instrument makes when it recognizes the right application. A slow, thin curve at the mouth, controlled and purposeful. He lifted the envelope. No question about whether I had thought this through. No gentle suggestion about keeping the peace or exploring a mediated resolution with family. He pressed a single button on his desk phone and pulled his paralegal team into the room. Over the next 3 hours, I didn't move from that chair while Whitfield rebuilt his office into an operational command center. Forensic accountants were mobilized. Title search agencies came online. He moved through bureaucratic obstruction, the way a cutting tool moves through soft material with no wasted motion and complete disregard for resistance. The blueprints I'd retrieved from a garbage bin, he treated not as salvage but as evidence marking a specific location on a map. I sat there with a glass of iced water and watched him work, and the last of whatever paternal grief had been lodged in my chest burned completely off, replaced by the clean precision of what comes next. Long golden light was stretching across the Charlotte skyline by the time he came back into the room with a stiff manila folder. He settled into his chair, and his face had taken on the measured gravity of a man delivering a verdict. He opened the folder, drew out a county-certified document, and placed it across the polished surface facing me. I recognized it before a single word of the heading reached me. The quitclaim deed. Whitfield pressed the tip of a silver pen against the lower right corner. Filed with the county clerk exactly 1 day after they sat at your kitchen table. He said, his voice carrying no inflection at all. You were correct in every particular, Mr. Halstead. They inserted this complete ownership transfer into the body of routine limited liability formation documents. You signed your entire estate over to them, behind the cover of a fabricated tax management arrangement. My own signature looked back at me from the page, solid dark. No hesitation in the ink. Alongside it, the official seal of Odell, the sweating, jittery notary who had made the whole mechanism function. The effect of seeing the document in its physical certified form was categorically different from piecing it together out of shredded strips on a tarp. The shreds had confirmed the theory. This confirmed the crime. I traced the line of my signature with one finger and told Whitfield I had initialed 50 pages that morning under the belief I was building something secure for my daughter's future. He drew a second document out of the folder and nodded. The notary's role was not incidental, he said flatly. He bypassed the mandatory verbal confirmation step with full awareness of what he was doing. State law obligated him to address you directly out loud in plain language and confirm that you understood you were executing a quitclaim deed and relinquishing your property rights. He left that step out deliberately to ensure you had no moment of clear recognition while it happened, fraudulent execution by the book. But the seizure of the property itself was only the opening stage of what they had constructed. What I was about to learn was not simply the fact of a betrayal. It was the complete architecture of what the people closest to me had been assembling in the dark for months before any of this surfaced. Whitfield settled back, fingertips meeting in front of him, his gaze carrying a compound of professional regard and measured caution. The commercial redevelopment blueprints you recovered from their discarded materials are genuine documents, but they reflect a long horizon. Brackett is not a patient man. Brackett had no intention of sitting idle while construction permits worked their way through the system. The moment that deed was secured, he had already executed a second move. Whitfield slid a final stack of papers across the desk. These weren't county filings. They were heavily redacted federal banking documents. I worked through the top sheet, parsing the dense columns of financial data. Brackett took your stolen certified quitclaim deed straight to Catawba Commercial Bank. Whitfield said, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper, careful and deliberate. He used the full unencumbered equity of your 5-acre estate as prime collateral to pull down an immediate massive cash loan. My eyes moved to the bolded figures near the foot of the banking contract. The number stopped me cold. Breckett had walked out of that bank with a $2.5 million commercial cash loan drawn against my land. Every dollar had been wired directly into an offshore corporate account that Voss Holdings controlled exclusively. That explained the gleaming slate-gray Maserati. That explained Claudine laughing over cocktails at a luxury ski resort on a random Tuesday afternoon. They weren't fighting off any lawsuit. They were spending stolen money like they had earned every cent of it. Breckett didn't simply take your land. Whitfield continued, his eyes fixed hard on mine. By presenting a fraudulently obtained deed to a federally insured banking institution in order to secure commercial financing, your son-in-law stepped across a very significant legal threshold. He committed textbook unambiguous federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud. This is no longer a family property dispute dressed up in civil litigation. This is a serious federal crime carrying decades of mandatory prison time. The silence that came down over the room was total. I sat inside it and let the data settle. My daughter and her husband had mortgaged my past to bankroll their own greed, and in doing so, they had placed the precise weapon I needed squarely in my hands. A civil action to reverse the deed would hand Breckett years of delays, letting him bleed away the very funds he had stolen. Federal bank fraud operated through an entirely different mechanism. The federal government does not offer arrangements to people who defraud insured institutions. Assets get frozen without warning. Investigators move in. The full machinery of federal law engages with no regard for what's convenient for the guilty party. I looked across the desk at Whitfield and felt a cold, settled clarity descend over me. My senile old man performance had held perfectly. They pictured me dissolving in my armchair, entirely unaware that I had been assembling a financial warhead directly beneath the floor they stood on. "What is our precise tactical approach, Mr. Brannock?" I asked, my voice carrying without effort through the quiet of the room. "I have no interest in merely frightening them. I want the trap shut before they even register it's moving." Whitfield's expression produced that same narrow, predatory smile, and he gathered the papers into a clean stack against the desk surface. "We build an impenetrable wall of evidence," he said, his tone smooth and deliberate. "We trace every cent of that $2.5 million wire transfer. We document their luxury expenditures to establish that the funds were never deployed for any legitimate corporate purpose. We put together a dossier so comprehensively damning that federal prosecutors have no discretion. They move immediately. And while all of that is being assembled, you go home. You keep performing as the confused, failing father. You let them walk your lawn with their measuring tape. You let them sketch out their retail center. You let them operate under the conviction that they are the sharpest operators in North Carolina. We let them keep digging quietly, patiently, right up until the precise moment we choose to bury them both under the full, crushing, inescapable weight of their own monstrous greed." Whitfield Brannock looked down at the banking documents spread across his desk, jaw set hard enough that a muscle moved in his cheek. He was a veteran who had spent decades pulling apart complex financial fraud, and very little rattled him. But the naked audacity of what Breckett had executed had ignited something sharp and professional in him. He had just traced the precise timeline of a flawlessly engineered, multi-million-dollar theft, and his legal instincts would not permit him to watch the stolen capital vanish into the void. He pushed his leather chair back from the desk wheels, gliding silently across the carpet, and reached for the secure landline at the corner of his desk. "Mr. Halstead, Whitfield," said, his voice dropping into a register that carried command and allowed no debate. "I respect the tactical argument for patience, but we cannot permit $2.5 million in illicitly obtained federal funds to settle comfortably into a Caribbean tax haven. Once that money disperses through offshore shell structures, recovery becomes an international jurisdictional nightmare. I have direct high-level contacts inside the FBI's white-collar crimes division. We need to place that call right now. Secure an emergency federal injunction and lock down Voss Holdings before your son-in-law moves another single cent." Whitfield lifted the receiver, finger poised above the keypad, fully prepared to bring the federal government down on Brackett's head. Before he could press the first digit, I reached across the desk and placed my hand firmly over his. I said nothing immediately. I simply held his gaze and felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was the smile of an engineer watching a confident saboteur place his foot directly onto a landmine he never detected. Whitfield paused. His eyes narrowed, reading the absolute unshakable composure in my expression. He set the receiver back in its cradle and leaned forward, his face shifting into something focused and guarded. "Mr. Halstead," I said, my voice smooth and precisely measured, entirely absent the panic or desperation that typically follows the discovery of a loss this size. "I don't want you to contact the federal authorities yet. I have no interest in his offshore accounts being frozen, and I don't want his celebration interrupted. What I want is for Beckett to feel completely untouchable. I want him convinced he has pulled off the most brilliant financial crime in the history of North Carolina real estate." Whitfield frowned and folded his hands on the desk. "With all due respect, Vernon allowing a criminal to actively launder millions of dollars against a forged quitclaim deed is an extraordinarily dangerous gamble. If we don't act quickly, he will drain every dollar of equity from your estate and leave you holding an empty foreclosed shell." I shook my head slowly, the cold smile not moving from my face. "That is precisely where you were mistaken, my friend," I said quietly. "Beckett cannot drain the equity from my estate because Beckett does not own my estate, and neither, as it happens, do I." I watched the seasoned litigator turn that statement over, sharp eyes moving across my face in search of confusion or instability. He found neither. I laid out the structural architecture of my hidden defense. "Go back into your county property records, Whitfield. Look past the fraudulent quitclaim deed that Beckett filed 2 weeks ago. Go all the way back to October of 2016. Whitfield turned immediately to his monitors, fingers moving across the keyboard in the practiced sequence. He pulled up the secure county clerk database and began working through the digital archives. As he scrolled through the historical filings tied to my residential address, I supplied the necessary context. In 2016, shortly after my late wife received her initial diagnosis, we sat down and had a very long, very difficult conversation about the future. I said, my voice steady despite the weight the memory still carried. We understood her condition was terminal. We also knew that our daughter Claudine had always had a weakness for fine things and expensive habits. We loved her without reservation, but we were not blind to her nature. My wife was terrified that after she was gone, Claudine might eventually wear me down into selling our sanctuary to fund some extravagant impulse. To honor my wife and protect the land we had shaped our life around, I made a definitive, legally unassailable move. Whitfield stopped typing. He leaned closer to his primary monitor, reading a deeply buried, highly complex legal filing. His eyes widened by a fraction, a rare fracture of genuine astonishment crossing his composed features. So, I engaged a specialized estate firm in Wilmington. I continued laying out the architecture of what I had quietly constructed, a firm with no connections whatsoever to anyone in Charlotte. I had taken the entire 5-acre estate, the house, the gardens, every blade of grass, and transferred absolute ownership into a highly restrictive, irrevocable blind trust. A neutral third-party corporate fiduciary was designated as the sole trustee. I am simply the designated occupant and passive beneficiary. I hold the legal right to live on that property until I draw my last breath, but I possess no legal authority to sell it, borrow against it, mortgage it, or sign it away to anyone. Whitfield slowly drew his gaze from the monitor and looked straight at me. The comprehension moving across his face was a remarkable thing to observe. He understood exactly what I had done. He grasped the full catastrophic magnitude of the trap Beckett had walked directly into without ever knowing it was there. "Therefore," I said, bringing the hammer down on the final inescapable conclusion, "the signature I placed on that fraudulent quitclaim deed at my kitchen table is legally worthless. It is a completely void instrument. An asset I hold no legal title to cannot be conveyed to anyone. The quitclaim deed transferring ownership to Voss Holdings is a spectacular piece of documented fraud and nothing more." Something low and genuine rumbled up from Whitfield's chest, breaking into a dark laugh. He pushed back in his chair and looked at the ceiling, absorbing what I had just told him. He walked a worthless document, something with zero legal standing on this earth, straight into the doors of a federally insured bank and pledged it as prime collateral. Whitfield said, mapping the catastrophic error aloud. He walked a major commercial lender out of $2.5 million using property he had no claim to. Vernon, your son-in-law didn't merely commit a crime against you. He committed a crime against the federal government. Textbook wire fraud, aggravated bank fraud, massive in scale. Precisely, I said, my voice carrying no warmth at all. Which is exactly why we do not pick up that phone today. We allow Beckett to push forward with his fraudulent eviction. The moment he places that void deed in front of a law enforcement officer, his criminal intent is cemented beyond any argument. The FBI inherits an airtight federal case. I walked out of Whitfield Brannock's corner office with Charlotte spread out below the glass behind me, his legal apparatus already spinning into motion. The framework we had built would eventually deliver Beckett into a federal wire fraud indictment. But one question still chewed at the edge of my thinking. Beckett had designed the financial machinery, the loan scheme, the holding company, all of it. Claudine, however, had been the one who reached inside my chest and dismantled whatever defenses I had. I needed to settle the question of her involvement once and for all. Was she simply riding the wave her husband had made, collecting the benefits without directing the harm? Or had she stood at the drafting table beside him from the beginning, an equal architect of her father's destruction? To answer that, I needed something a courtroom could use. I needed to hear her unguarded, her real voice, not the performed version she brought to my kitchen table. I stopped at a specialized electronics shop on the city's edge and bought a military-grade voice-activated micro-recorder with real-time cellular transmission and a built-in GPS tracker. The unit was barely the size of a matchbook sealed in flat matte black casing, engineered to disappear in any shadow. I drove back to my property, the one they were already mentally subdividing, and prepared the set. A pot of chamomile tea brewed on the stove, left to go flat and lukewarm. I pulled on slept-in clothes, left the razor on the shelf, and let my posture sag into the shape of a man losing ground to his own mind. Then I dialed Claudine. I let my breathing go thin and ragged before she picked up. I fed every syllable through a tremor, pitching it just right, helpless, confused a little, frightened. Claudine, I managed breaking it with a weak cough. It has been a rough day. I went through every drawer looking for the property tax papers and I can't find them anywhere. My chest has been tight all morning. Do you think you could come sit with me for a while? Have some tea? There was a pause, a fraction of a second too long, the sound of a woman calculating cost against optics. Of course, Dad, she said, her voice wrapped in the same synthetic warmth she always deployed. Stay where you are. I am on my way. She pulled up in under an hour. Through the front window, I watched her step out of her car, swinging an oversized, impeccably crafted Cobalt Louis Vuitton handbag from one shoulder. Brand new, limited edition. The price tag would have covered more than 2 months of the wages I earned in my working years. A leather-bound receipt for what they had stolen. I made it to the front door in shuffling, hesitant steps, fumbling at the brass deadbolt with hands that I kept shaking on purpose. When the door swung open and she saw me, unshaven, rumpled, visibly frayed, a flicker crossed her face before the mask of sympathy settled back into place. Pure satisfaction. She had seen exactly what she expected to see. From where she stood, my decline was running on schedule, tracking neatly against her demolition calendar. I guided her back to the kitchen with short, shuffling steps. Pouring the tea, I let my wrist go loose, spilling a thin spread of amber across the marble counter. "Oh, look at that," I said, voice dropping in embarrassed resignation. "My hands don't answer me the way they once did. I am sorry, Claudine." She made a sound barely audible, barely civil, and set her Cobalt Louis Vuitton bag down on the island away from the wet. "It's fine, Dad," she said, already pulling paper towels and stroking the counter clean in the tight, irritated passes. "Sit down, please, before something worse happens." I settled into the kitchen chair and folded my hands on my knees. We sat. I drifted through a rambling half-story about the weather, letting it trail off mid-thought. Claudine checked the time on her diamond wristwatch once, twice, 3 times, inside 5 minutes. She was already somewhere else in her head, somewhere she'd rather be. "Dad, I need to step away for just a moment," she said, getting to her feet and straightening her blouse. "I'll be right back. Beckett needs me to confirm our dinner reservation." She moved off down the hallway with quick, purposeful steps. The bathroom door clicked shut behind her. I sat still and counted. Then came the muffled sound of her voice through the wood she had taken a call. I came out of that chair with a quietness and ease that would have alarmed her if she'd seen it. Down the hall I went and pressed close against the door. She was talking to Beckett. "I'm heading out in 5 minutes," she said, and the contempt in her voice was stripped of any pretense. "Being in that house any longer than I have to be, I can't do it. It smells like old medicine and closed rooms. He's completely gone, Beckett, spilled tea on himself like a small child. We have absolutely nothing to worry about from him contesting any eviction. Odds are he ends up in memory care before the first machine breaks ground." That was all I needed. Her own words, spoken in the voice she reserved for private conversations, extinguished whatever residual doubt I was still carrying. This was not a woman who had been pulled along reluctantly. This was a predator, equal in intention, equal in cruelty. I moved back to the kitchen without a sound. Her cobalt Louis Vuitton bag sat open on the island. I slid 2 fingers into my pocket, closed them around the matte black recorder, and positioned myself over the bag. Inside, I found a small zippered cosmetic pocket pressed against the silk lining. I placed the device into the deepest corner of that pocket, zipped it closed with the care of a watchmaker, setting a mainspring, and withdrew my hand. Nothing disturbed, nothing visible. I was back in my chair cup in front of me by the time her footsteps came back up the hall. Claudine grabbed the bag from the island, told me she would call tomorrow, and left with the efficiency of someone who had stayed 8 minutes longer than they planned. I watched her taillights disappear down the road, taking my device deep into the center of their operation. Hours passed. The North Carolina night came down heavy and full over my property, and I sat in the complete quiet of my study, with only one light in the room, the steady green pulse of the audio receiver on my desk. I measured out a single pour of expensive-aged bourbon, let the first sip travel slow, and leaned back in my worn leather recliner with the volume dial between my fingers. What came through was immediate and clear, Beckett and Claudine's voices, loose with confidence, laughing over the scale of what they had pulled off. Every word was locked into the recording, permanent, unambiguous, exactly the kind of evidence that closes a federal case for good and puts 2 people away for the better part of 20 years. That image, the green light pulsing in the dark study, broke apart and gave way to the hard light of a North Carolina morning. I was standing on my front porch with summer hanging in the air like wet cloth. Facing me, holding a manila folder that contained a fraudulent eviction notice, was Deputy Garland. He had the look of a man assigned to something he hadn't asked for. Shifting his weight between his boots, a young officer who had been briefed that this was a routine call, an old man who had muddled his paperwork and lost his home to his own confusion. The street sat quiet around us. Then the horn started, a hard rhythmic blast from the curb. I looked past Deputy Garland to where Beckett had parked his gleaming slate-gray Maserati positioned directly across my driveway, blocking it without apology. He sat behind the wheel with the window down, elbow out, that broad, smug grin settled on his face, like a man who believes the last move has already been made, palm flat on the horn, holding it. "Clock's run out, old man." Beckett's voice punched through the morning, quiet like a fist. "Get him off that porch, deputy. I've got a wrecking crew burning daylight, and that bill lands on me whether they're working or not." The laugh that followed was ugly, brittle, and triumphant, the sound of a man who believes his scheme has already won. Deputy Garland pulled in a long breath and let it out slow, a look on his face that walked right up to the edge of pity, then took a reluctant step my way. "Mr. Halstead." His voice shifted into that measured, too gentle cadence people instinctively adopt with the elderly. "Sir, I genuinely regret this, but a court order carries legal force. Voss Holdings has title to this property. You'll need to take what belongs to you and go. If getting to a care facility is the concern, I can radio for an ambulance right now." His hand came up between us, hovering there, and offered to steer me away from the only piece of ground I still called home. He was an instrument, nothing more, a local badge who had no idea he'd just stepped into the middle of a sprawling federal crime. My feet did not move. My body did not tremble. I did not press a hand to my chest and give them the doddering old man they'd scripted. Whatever frail, defeated version of me they had rehearsed this moment around, he was nowhere to be found. I squared my shoulders, lengthened my spine, and met the deputy's eyes dead on. Something changed in the air between us. His outstretched hand fell back to his side, and that look of pity curdled into something sharper, confused, suddenly uncertain. "Deputy?" I said the words coming out with the flat, unhurried authority I'd carried on deep-water drilling rigs for over 30 years. "Before you serve that order, before you commit what would be the most catastrophic error of your entire career in law enforcement. I need you to listen to something my devoted daughter said the night before last. My hand went into my trouser pocket and came back out holding my smartphone. Steady, no hesitation, no tremor. One tap opened the secure audio file, the one I'd lifted directly off the micro recorder, planted inside Claudine's cobalt Louis Vuitton handbag. Propped against the thick porch railing half hidden in the cluster of potted ferns, sat a heavy-duty Bluetooth speaker I'd sourced specifically for this morning, engineered to throw sound over the din of the heavy equipment. I paired it with my phone. A low bass tone confirmed the connection. My eyes moved to the street. Beckett had taken his hand off the horn. That self-satisfied grin had gone slightly uncertain as he tried to read what was unfolding on my porch. I ran the volume all the way to the top and hit play. What came out of that speaker was not sound, it was detonation. The recording tore across the suburban street and hit the brick faces of the neighboring houses like a shockwave. Claudine's voice, captured only hours before, inside their townhouse, filled the morning with a breathless, covetous energy that turned my stomach. Beckett, the bank manager, needs to hear from you the moment they open tomorrow. Her voice left no room for doubt. That second wire transfer has to clear before the old fool figures out his accounts are already gone. The volume was merciless. Deputy Garland's body reacted. Before his mind caught up, he stumbled a half-step backward, his hand swinging toward his utility belt. Across the street, the slate-gray Maserati hadn't moved an inch, Beckett locked motionless behind the wheel. The recording gave no quarter. Then his voice arrived, boastful, smooth, utterly incriminating, pouring out of that speaker for every neighbor and one sworn officer to absorb. "Relax about the bank, baby." Beckett's recorded voice spilled across the lawn. "Everything's buttoned up. That fool put his signature on a quitclaim deed and never read a syllable of what he was signing. Swallowed the whole tax management line without blinking. A $2.5 million federal commercial loan, secured against an asset that doesn't exist. And here's the sweetest part, he's still walking around believing he owns this land." From the speaker came the ring of crystal. Meeting crystal, a toast between two people celebrating the architecture of my destruction. "Crews hit the site Monday." Beckett's recorded voice oozed satisfaction. "Every dollar goes offshore by Tuesday afternoon." I didn't move a muscle. I just watched the color drain out of Deputy Garland's face like water through a cracked pipe. He wasn't a man to be fooled. He was a sworn officer, and he was gripping an eviction notice that had just been exposed in his own ears in crystalline audio as the paper instrument of a federal bank fraud. The deputy's gaze dropped to the manila folder, then climbed back up to my face. His eyes carried a new weight, the sudden sickening comprehension of exactly what he'd walked into. That document wasn't a lawful order. It was evidence of a coordinated crime. Every trace of condescension evaporated. In its place came the locked, narrowed focus of a law enforcement officer who has just recognized the scale of what he's standing inside. His hand moved to his shoulder, fingers finding the radio mic and unclipping it, his attention sliding hard toward the slate-gray Maserati. Over there, understanding had finally arrived for Beckett, and it had arrived like a wall. The smug certainty that had been plastered across his face was gone. What replaced it was ugly, the naked, flinching terror of a man watching his carefully assembled world come apart in real time. He knew what flawless audio played for a uniformed officer 20 feet away meant for his future. There was no exit left, no story to spin, no performance of innocence that could survive what had just come through that speaker. His hand shook as he grabbed the gear shift and wrenched the car into drive. The engine tore loose, and the tires bit the asphalt with a shriek as he lunged for escape. He was far too late. The mechanism I'd spent months engineering had already closed around him, every exit sealed, before he ever knew the trap existed. And my porch speaker still had more to say. The recording moved without pause, shifting from their financial gloating into territory so dark it recalibrated the entire morning. The audio held its quality throughout every nuance of their townhouse caught on tape. Claudine's voice came through next, precise, unhurried, cold, in the way that only premeditation sounds. Once they drag him out, get him placed in one of those budget state facilities. The words bounced off the surrounding brick. Make sure his premium heart medication gets canceled. He's 70 Beckett. Without those prescriptions, his heart won't last a month. We pocket the $2.5 million the demolition crew levels the place, and we disappear clean. Those words didn't just hang in the air. They occupied it, pressing down on the whole street like a weight. Front doors swung open one by one. Neighbors stepped out across their lawns, whatever they'd been doing, abandoned all of them, turning toward my yard with the same shell-shocked expression. A woman had just broadcast in her own voice the planned death of her own father, and the entire block had heard every word. On my porch, Deputy Garland stood completely still, his gaze fixed on that speaker nested in the ferns. The manila envelope went slack in his grip, and the pages inside fluttered down across the floorboards. He was no longer dealing with a disoriented elderly man, making a futile last stand against a legal proceeding. He was looking at the target of a premeditated murder conspiracy. The young officer's throat moved as he swallowed. His training surfaced through the initial shock, steady and mechanical. His right hand found the radio clipped to his tactical belt and closed around it. No questions were needed. The recording had supplied every answer. Out in the street, the slate-gray Maserati's engine cut out. In his scramble to throw the car into gear and run from the ruins of his own scheme, Beckett had lost all coordination. His elbow caught the large insulated ceramic travel mug wedged in the center console. I stood there on that porch and felt something cold and deeply satisfying settle in my chest as the dark liquid cascaded across his lap and soaked into the spotless leather seat beneath him. He knocked the mug completely free, the remaining contents washing across the passenger side. He didn't reach for a thing. He sat rigid, both hands strangling the steering wheel, his knuckles gone white, his eyes darting in short, panicked bursts toward the officer on my porch. On the passenger side, Claudine had stepped out onto the street. The triumphant look she'd been wearing minutes earlier had been stripped away, not faded, not softened, but erased. As her own voice continued to detail exactly how she intended to arrange my death, the blood left her face completely. The careful layers of her makeup read suddenly as something theatrical and hollow, a costume, not a face. Total exposure hit her like a physical force. One hand came up and pressed against her lips, shaking. Her eyes found mine and stayed there. The story she'd been living inside was over. She knew I had always known. No new version of events could be assembled, no tears summoned on demand, no curtain left to hide behind. From the height of my porch, I looked down and took in what remained of the two people who had constructed my elimination. Months of it treating me as a problem, to be disposed of a liability with an expiration date standing between them and a fortune. They had taken the grief I carried for my late wife and sharpened it into a tool to use against me. They had taken my love for my daughter and used it to pry away the last place in this world that was mine. And when all of that still fell short of what they wanted, they had sat together in their upscale townhouse and quietly scheduled the date of my death. Hearing those words spoken aloud, the coldest, most unforgivable extent of what they had plotted should have broken something inside me. Instead, what I felt was a kind of hardening, a calcification of purpose that left no room for grief. I picked my way carefully around the eviction papers scattered across the porch floorboards and moved to the railing's edge. My eyes found Claudine and stayed there. My voice stayed down. Not a trace of anger crossed my face. I gave her nothing. No warmth, no fury, not even recognition. Just the flat, evacuated stare of a man who had severed every tie that once bound him to another person. The street had gone completely quiet around us, the only sound the soft static hiss of Deputy Garland's shoulder radio as he readied himself to call for backup. The morning sun kept rising, drawing long, clean shadows across the dew-heavy grass, lighting up the precise moment the hunters became the hunted. "Deputy," I said, my eyes never leaving my daughter, "I believe you now have more than sufficient probable cause to proceed with arrests, conspiracy to commit murder alongside the federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud already executed through a forged quitclaim deed." Deputy Garland didn't waste a breath. His thumb hit the transmit button, and when he spoke, every trace of the gentle, patronizing tone from minutes earlier was gone. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I need immediate backup at my current location. Priority 1. We have a confirmed 109 in progress. Suspect vehicle is a slate-gray Maserati directly across from the target residence. Do not let that vehicle leave the perimeter." Beckett was clawing at the ignition in a frenzy, his desperation to get the stalled car restarted, betrayed by hands shaking too badly to close properly around the key. Claudine hadn't moved from the concrete driveway, her knees buckling slightly as the distant climbing wail of approaching sirens reached the street. The corporate fortress they'd spent months assembling was collapsing around them in real time. They had been certain the plan was sealed tight. They had taken my age as an assurance that I would be compliant, easy to move, easy to discard. What they had never accounted for was that an engineer spends his entire working life anticipating exactly where a structure will fail and building traps at every point of weakness for anyone who tries to game the system. The real precision of what I'd built wasn't the recording alone. It was the absolute futility baked into the crime itself. Even if they'd managed to clear that driveway, even if they'd somehow outrun both the local police and the federal indictments already moving toward them, they would still have landed on nothing. The irrevocable blind trust I'd established years earlier made the quitclaim deed they'd so carefully forged worth less than the paper it was printed on. The $2.5 million they had pulled out of that federal loan was secured against a phantom, an asset that existed nowhere but in the documents they had fabricated. They had staked their freedom, their futures, and every year they had left for a property they could never legally touch. The demolition crew would stand idle. The luxury retail center would never see a single shovel break ground. I watched the first black and white cruiser swing hard around the corner, light bars strobing against the quiet faces of the neighborhood homes. It came in fast and sharp, cutting off the slate-gray Maserati from the street. 2 more units arrived within seconds, sealing the car from every angle. Officers stepped out with hands resting purposefully near holstered weapons. Deputy Garland came off my porch steps at a jog, angling toward the driveway, where Claudine stood frozen and Beckett sat trapped inside his own disaster. I reached over and cut the power on the Bluetooth speaker. The recording died. In its place came the sharp, layered commands of law enforcement taking ownership of the scene. I turned away from the flashing lights, the shouted orders, and the ragged, breaking sobs of the woman who once was my daughter. I walked inside and pressed the heavy oak door shut behind me. For a moment, I stood in the hallway, letting the full weight of what had just happened settle through the house. The red and blue pulses came through the frosted entryway glass, throwing wild, strobing shadows across the walls of the only sanctuary I had left. I had meant to let the authorities finish what I'd started to wash my hands of them both, but the methodical engineer who lives at the center of my thinking demanded one final step before the system could be considered closed. A structure is not fully decommissioned until the last valve is sealed and every trace of residual pressure has bled out. I gripped the brass handle, swung the heavy door back open, and walked out onto the porch again. The thick North Carolina humidity rolled in as I descended the 3 wooden steps, my boots meeting the concrete walkway in a slow, measured cadence. No raised voice, not a single tear. My breathing was even and controlled my pulse, carrying the steady, unhurried rhythm of a man who had taken back everything that was his. I crossed the street through the grid of flashing cruisers with the quiet bearing of someone returning from a long way off. The entire neighborhood had gone still. People stood in their yards in robes and slippers, watching in stunned silence as the polished, arrogant couple from the city was methodically dismantled. Beckett had been pressed face down across the hood of his own car, wrists locked behind him in steel cuffs, cheek flat against the hot metal eyes darting in every direction like something cornered. The coffee stains had spread dark and deep across the fine fabric of his tailored trousers. But I didn't spare Beckett a second look. My attention belonged entirely to Claudine. She was standing near the edge of the driveway, trembling with the kind of full-body shaking that starts from somewhere deep and works its way out. A female officer had a firm hold on her upper arm, the only thing keeping her from folding onto the concrete. Claudine's eyes found me wide, desperate, silently searching for the forgiving father she had spent years running through. She was waiting for me to intervene, to step between her and what she'd built for herself, to pull her back from the edge by sheer force of habit. I stopped exactly 3 FT from her. The air between us was heavy, pressurized, carrying the charge of a storm, moving through a space where something used to stand. I looked at the woman I had raised, the child I had held through tears, the daughter I had loved with everything I had. I searched her face for any shadow of my late wife. There was nothing there to find. She had been hollowed out entirely by a greed that had no bottom. "You didn't just try to take my home, Claudine," I said. My voice was level and unhurried, cutting cleanly through the crackle of police radios on every side. A fresh wave of tears spilled over her lashes, carving dark lines through her ruined makeup. I didn't reach for a tissue. I didn't extend a hand. You signed my death warrant for $2 million. Each word arrived like something measured and deliberate. You sat down and calmly planned to murder your own father by cutting off my medication. You came into my home, drank my tea, and worked out exactly how many days my heart would hold without those premium prescriptions. You were going to leave me in a cheap state facility, wait for me to quietly expire, and walk away without a scratch. A strangled, broken sound came from her throat. She tried to form words, tried to reach for some version of an explanation, but nothing came. Her voice crushed under the full weight of my knowing. Across the hood of the Maserati, Beckett had started twisting against the officer's grip, his voice spilling out in fragmented, frantic pieces. Something about a misunderstanding, something about corporate restructuring, temporary liquidations. I turned my head deliberately and held his gaze. The unraveling wreck of the man, looking back at me, was all the confirmation I needed that every calculation I had made was sound. Beckett, you always believed you were the smartest man in any room. I said, pitching my voice just enough that the officers working the scene caught every word. You decided I was nothing but a senile old man who'd put his name on a quitclaim deed without a thought. You were certain you'd cut me off from my own property, but you never once ran a basic title search. The color drained out of him completely, leaving something pale and slack behind. The struggling stopped. His chest hitched. I established an irrevocable blind trust in 2016. I continued watching the remaining life seem to evacuate the both of them. That property belongs to the trust, outright managed by an independent fiduciary. My personal signature has no legal authority to transfer ownership. I cannot convey title to an asset I don't legally control. The document you filed is a ghost ink on paper, nothing more. The full devastation of where they actually stood landed on them like a structure giving way at the foundation. Everything they had built, every move they had made, every risk they had taken, all of it had been erected on a lie from the very first day. I stepped slightly closer to Beckett and dropped my voice to a register that left him no choice but to listen. Are you clear on what this does to your commercial loan, Beckett? My tone was measured, almost soft. You sat down across from a federally insured bank, handed over a wholly invented document, and used it to pull $2.5 million in wire funds. The collateral you pledged is an asset you have no legal claim to, not now, not ever. Every dollar parked in that offshore account is floating on nothing. That bank has zero enforceable lien against this land. What you ran wasn't a family hustle. You built a machine for federal wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud, and you ran it at full speed. The words didn't just land on him, they seemed to pass through him. Beckett's legs stopped holding his knees, folding his body, sagging into the side of the cruiser. The officers on either arm, the only thing keeping him from the ground. Claudine drove both hands over her face and let out a loud, wrenching cry, the sound of someone whose entire constructed reality had just gone to rubble. I had engineered it this way with precision. I'd allowed the fraudulent eviction to proceed, let them walk their forged paperwork straight into the view of local law enforcement building, the federal case a brick at a time, and handing the authorities an unimpeachable documented record of deliberate criminal purpose. I stood in the bright North Carolina sunlight, a man who had held his ground and watched in quiet stillness as the cruisers began transporting the wreckage of what used to be my family. Up and down the block, the neighborhood held its breath, bearing silent witness to the total collapse of two people who had gambled everything on destroying me. The local units had barely sealed the perimeter when the next wave arrived before Beckett could make any last frantic reach for the door of his slate-gray Maserati, before he could mount one final attempt to pull free of Deputy Garland's hold. What came around that corner did not ask permission. 3 massive flat black unmarked SUVs hit the suburban street at speed, punching through the residential quiet like something from another world entirely. They swept into formation with mechanical precision, their heavy tires howling and trailing smoke as they locked into a tactical blockade, a wall of dark steel and blacked-out glass that shut the street off completely, folding Beckett and Claudine inside a federal cordon with no seam to find. Every door came open at once. 12 federal agents dropped onto the pavement in the thick North Carolina heat, each step placed with a controlled, almost eerie quiet boots, finding the ground in unison, dark tactical vests emblazoned with the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The smell of scorched rubber spread across the manicured front yards, dissolving the last of the morning dew. At the front of the federal detachment walked Whitfield Brannock, My longtime litigation attorney climbed out of the lead vehicle in a suit that looked as though it had been pressed 10 minutes ago, everything about him a deliberate contrast to the body armor moving around him. He adjusted his tie, lifted his eyes to my porch, and delivered one crisp, unhurried nod. Every component of the mechanism we had assembled in his downtown office had engaged exactly on schedule. A pair of agents peeled directly toward Beckett. The local deputies yielded ground without a word, handing federal jurisdiction over cleanly and without friction. From somewhere deep in Beckett's chest came a thin, panicked noise, the sound a man makes when he finally understands there is no exit. The agents got both hands on him, and he twisted, desperate to wrench himself loose his expensive Italian loafers, skating across the wet concrete where his spilled coffee had spread. They spun him and planted him face first across the hood of his own Maserati. The metal gave a deep, ugly crease, forming in what had been flawless custom bodywork. There was something almost architectural about it, a precise structural failure on the surface of the thing he'd prized most. Beckett Voss, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal bank fraud, aggravated wire fraud, and attempted extortion of a federally insured financial institution. The lead agent's voice carried the flat, absolute weight of institutional authority as the Miranda warnings followed. Federal handcuffs closed around Beckett's wrists with a cold metallic snap that reached every corner of that silent street. He lay with his cheek pressed to the warm, dented hood eyes open, and seeing nothing, a man whose entire operating framework had just been declared void. The wealthy corporate architect with a fraudulent deed was gone. What remained was a federal defendant with a maximum security cell waiting at the end of a short road. Claudine hadn't moved from the driveway's edge, watching the total dismantling of her husband and her stolen future happen in sequence, one step at a time. The agents weren't going to leave her out of it. A tall, sharply composed female agent stepped toward her, pulling a second set of steel cuffs from her belt. The moment Claudine's eyes landed on that hardware, everything that had been holding her together gave way at once. The cold, methodical woman who had sketched out the timeline of my death with such casual precision, she simply wasn't there anymore. Claudine's legs went out her knees, hitting the rough asphalt, hard, the impact tearing through the fabric of her expensive designer trousers. The full, inescapable weight of what her life had just become crashed down and buried her. She came apart completely, an ugly, gasping sob tearing out of her, and lifted her face toward me, up on that porch, not moving. "Daddy, please!" The scream traveled the full length of the block, pulling every neighbor to their door. "Please make them stop. Tell them it's all a mistake. I am your daughter. I am your little girl. Please don't let them do this." Her makeup had dissolved into dark, jagged tracks across the pallor of her face. Both arms reached toward me, hands grasping at nothing, searching for the father she had bled dry of mercy and then discarded. She had built her whole plan around the assumption that I would always step in front of the consequences headed for her, that the reflex of a lifetime would override everything she had done. My feet stayed exactly where they were. Not 1 degree of my posture gave. I had nothing to offer her, not a word, not a look, not a movement that could be mistaken for softness. From above, I looked down at her with a face that had been emptied of everything. The father, who had bent his life around protecting her, the aging man she had quietly scheduled for disposal in a state-run facility. Neither one of those men existed any longer. Gone. Finished. I held her gaze through all of it, and registered only a deep, cold, and absolute quiet inside myself. My little girl ceased to exist the moment she decided my life had a dollar value. I said, my voice crossing the lawn without effort level, drained of warmth, carrying the full and final weight of a closed verdict. Enjoy your new life in federal prison. She took those words the way a body takes an impact. Her mouth opened, a sharp breath in. Then the female agent had her by both arms, pulling them back, and the cuffs closed with a snap that made it all irreversible. I didn't linger for what came next. I turned away from the light bars, the shouted commands, the diminishing sound of her voice still calling after me. My boots moved back across the porch boards, stepping over the scattered eviction papers that lay where they'd fallen, useless, meaningless documents now shed like dead skin across the floorboards. I gripped the brass handle, stepped through into the cool stillness of the house, and pulled the heavy oak door shut at my back. The deadbolt engaged with a deep, clean click, and that was the end of it. Every sound from the street was cut off, instantly absorbed into the settled, unbroken quiet of a house that was fully, irrevocably mine. I walked toward my private study at a measured pace, steady and unhurried, and I did not look back at any of it. If you've stayed with me this far, I want you to know that I see you, and I hope something in this story reaches whatever you're carrying right now. Looking back on everything that happened, I won't pretend it didn't leave marks. Trusting the wrong people, especially the ones who were supposed to love you, that kind of wound doesn't close overnight. But I believe God doesn't let our hardest seasons go to waste. The pain had a purpose. The patience I was forced to practice, the silence I had to hold, while the evidence stacked up all of it, shaped me into something steadier than I was before. That is not nothing. If this story taught me anything worth passing along, it's this. First, protect what you've built. An irrevocable trust, a documented record, a paper trail. These are not just legal tools. They are the difference between a predator succeeding and a predator failing. Second, when someone moves against you in secret, your most powerful response is evidence, not emotion. Gather it quietly. Let it do the talking. Third, love is not a reason to abandon your judgment. The people who exploit you most are usually the ones who count on your heart outrunning your mind. Fourth, no scheme built on a lie can hold its own weight forever. That is one of the most reliable laws I know in engineering and in life. These grandpa revenge stories don't get told often enough, but they need to be, because father stories like this one carry something real, a reminder that wisdom, patience, and a willingness to do the hard work of truth-telling are more powerful than any forged document or manufactured tear. If this story moved you, drop a thought in the comments. I genuinely read them. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to defend what's yours. And if you haven't subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, yet this is a good moment to do it. There's more to come. Thank you for being here. Take good care of yourself.